Robert, thanks for joining us here on behalf of Kansas Humanities. We will be asking a little bit about your service. If you would please state your full name and your branch of service and the time frame in which you served.
My name is Robert Robbins. I served in the United States Air Force between 1969, August of 1969, and February of 1977. And I was fortunate enough to go into the military under a new program that had just been started by the Air Force. It was called the Delayed Enlistment Program. It allowed you to sign up and then actually leave for your tour of duty at a later point in time, which is pretty good for me. I my there's a little bit of comedy attached to my initial contact with the Air Force because back in 1968, that was the year I graduated from high school, and it was also the year that I turned 18 years old. Well, at that particular time, they were having the draft, the military draft, and you had to go take a physical, a pre-draft physical, when you turned 18. And we used to go down. It was located down on 22nd and Broadway, I think. That was the induction center, and it was so funny because after my 18th birthday, I had gone in there, and they give you a physical, and then if you, because I was still in high school, I wasn't being drafted at that particular time. They won't draft you until you after you complete high school. So I still had some time to go because my birthday was in March, and I was going to graduate in June. So after they give you your physical, they sit you out in this huge room, and all there is just lines of chairs. And all these guys are sitting out there that have had their physical. Now, some of these guys are like me, they're down there for a pre-draft physical, but some of the guys had been drafted, and they were down there to take their physical, and they were actually going to be bussed out that same day. That's when we took buses there. So they were being bussed out the same day. And so I was sitting out there in this big, huge room, and this guy from the Marines comes out, and he says, well, guys, he says, we need some volunteers for the Marines this month. Now, in 1968, as far as I'm concerned, it wasn't a good time to be a Marine. I had some friends that were Marines, and they were in Marines during that time. And from what I understand from them, things were so bad in Vietnam that they were almost willing to do anything not to have to go back. If you had done a tour of duty over there, you didn't want to go back. And I had a friend that actually shot his thumb off so he wouldn't have to go back. And at that time, I knew I didn't want to be a Marine. So the Marine guy comes out and he's standing up there on the stage because they have him elevated on the stage. And he's standing up to the stage. He says, "Well, guys," he says, "we need some volunteers from the Marines this month." And naturally, nobody was going to volunteer for the Marines. You know, he just didn't want to be a Marine, like I said. So he says, "Well," he just started to point guys out into the in the audience. I think you want to be a Marine. I know you want to be a Marine. I think you'll make a great Marine. And he just goes through and he picks out these individuals, and they are drafted into the Marines. That was enough to let me know that I didn't want a military career to be that way. So there were really three ways to avoid the military during that particular time. One was to leave the country, which I wasn't planning on doing. Another was to go to college, uh, and I did attempt that. I actually went to four different schools in one semester, first semester, and I never made it through a first semester. So, like I said, they had this program called the Delayed Enlistment Program. So I decided, well, I can still hang around for another year. I'll go and I'll sign up with the Air Force on the Delayed Enlistment Program, which is what I did. And after that, let's see here. So I kind of hung around the city for a year. It was like a free year for me because I really didn't have to work. I was out of high school, and I knew what I was going to be doing. Started in '69. So I hung around the city, and then I went down and I was inducted, and they gave us a departure date. And actually, this was when we used the old municipal airport. And I'd never been on an airplane before. I was 18 years old. Never really been out of the city for any period of time, and not very far out of Kansas City. And so that's how my military career got started. Um, Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, August 1969 until January of 1970 was when I graduated. And I remember it so well was because while I was in technical school, I got a chance to see the Chiefs play in the first Super Bowl. Oh, actually, not in the first one, in the one that they won in 1970.
Third.
Yeah, the third Super Bowl in 1970. So those were some good times for me. Those were some good times for me. Uh, then after I went to technical school, and I did go to technical school to be a communication center specialist. That's actually what I tested into, because they do give you this battery of tests before you actually get in, and that determines what they have planned for your career as far as the military goes. So I was a communications center specialist, or that was going to be my career. So I went to Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas, and unfortunately, right now I have this taste for Texas, and I think it stems from my from my basic and my technical skills training. Because I don't know if you've been to Texas in southern Texas in August, but it's a lot hotter than it is here in Kansas City. And when you're marching around all in that tarmac, it can get pretty bad. It can get pretty bad. But anyway, I made it through that. And one of the things I really remember about that time was after graduation. After graduation, you get your one stripe because you're a no striper before while you're going through basic training. And I got my first stripe. And I was walking on the lower level of the barracks, and one of my TIs, that's what was our training instructor, was walking by, and he asked me. He said, "Well," he said, "you feel pretty good about that stripe, don't you?" I said, "Boy, it sure does feel good to have the stripe on." He says, "Well, guess what? If you work hard enough, that can just be a starting point for you, and you can have a lot more of those stripes." And that's when I really realized that, boy, he's right. I see all these guys walking around with these 6 and 7 stripes on their arms. Why can't I do the same thing? And that kind of kickstarted my military career, and it pushed me. That really pushed me to do more things. Uh, so I ended up leaving basic training, or technical school rather, and my first permanent duty station was Whiteman Air Force Base, Knob, Missouri, home of the I think it was the 35th Strategic Air Command. But anyway, it was a missile base. I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that they had these missile silos throughout the Midwest, and that's where these missiles resided. And because of the fact that I was going to a missile base, there were certain types of security clearances that I had to have. And the security background checks started shortly after that. The FBI went around, they talked to some family members, they talked to our neighbor, and they talked to some of the people at the school that I went to. I graduated from Central High School. And so they did this background check, and because of the fact that I was on the missile base, I had to have a special security clearance, and it was called a PSYOP. It was top secret PSYOP clearance. PSYOP stood for Single Integrated Operational Plan, which means that I was going to be down in the room where they have the button that you push to launch the missiles. So they do an extensive background check for that. They did what was called a crypto clearance, and that was it was because of the communication and things that go out have to be encrypted. So I had a clearance for that, and things were going really well. I enjoyed my time down at Knob. I was able to come home on the weekends. It was really kind of new because At that particular time, the shift schedule was 3, 3, and 3. You worked 3 swings, 3 days, and 3 midnights, and then you were off for 3 days. Yeah, it was kind of grueling at first, but you got used to it. Matter of fact, the first weekend that I got off, I actually didn't go back when I was supposed to. So my first weekend, I was AWOL. And fortunately, I worked with a guy that was a 3-striper, and he was pretty understanding. He realized that it was my first week, and I'd gotten the days confused as to when I was supposed to be back, because I was supposed to go back on a midnight shift. And I was thinking about I was supposed to go back the next day when I should have been back a day earlier. So it really wasn't a major problem. He called me at home and explained to me where I went wrong. He said he'd cover for me, which was pretty good. So I spent 1 year at Whiteman, and then my next duty was overseas, and I was fortunate enough to be able to go to this little small island in the Pacific called Guam, 35 square miles. And so I was stationed in Anderson. Anderson was basically owned by the Navy. It was a Navy island. The Air Force was only a very small portion of it. The one Air Force base there. We did have some B-52s that spent some time there. That was sometimes a stopping point for refueling for them. So I got an opportunity to see the B-52s. Well, while I was on Guam, having like I said, known that I could have the opportunities to get some better jobs if I worked hard enough, and if I did what I was supposed to do, the good jobs would come. Well, one of the jobs I got, because I was a good typist, I worked for a group called the Director of Operational Planning. And what they did was they planned the bombing missions in Vietnam. So even though I never set foot in Southeast Asia, I feel that I did play a major role in Vietnam, because I used to type what was called the frag orders. And these were the bombing missions for the B-52s. The Doppel people, as we called them, they were a lot of officers, Air Force officers. I think a couple of colonels and one general were part of that program, and then they had some captains and some majors. And they actually used to sit down with this. They had this extremely large table. I remember that, and they would have all these maps on this table, and that's how they would determine what was going to be bombed. And we used to have to type up those orders and send them to wherever the departing station was from, where the bombers were going to be leaving from, so that they could have them. And we'd type up those, and that's when we used paper tape machines to type and to send communications. I actually got a chance to work on one of the first computers ever made, the UNIVAC 1004. That was our first computer that we had at Guam. And that would send paper tape, it would send cards, and also magnetic tape, things that we probably don't even use anymore. But so I really did have a direct effect on what transpired in Vietnam, even though I never actually made it to Southeast Asia. And that was the first step in my military career, because that kind of gave me an opportunity to move forward. And I thought, okay, I'm a good typist now. I can get a good job like this. Let me see what else I can excel at to maybe move me a little further. Well, after I left there, I actually went to the base communications. The Director of Operation Planning, there was 2 communication centers on base. One was operated by Air Force Communications Service, and one was operated by SAC. SAC, which was the Strategic Air Command, they actually had their own communications. Their stuff was kind of like, this is our secret stuff. We don't want anybody else knowing about what we're doing, so we'll have our own communications. And then Air Force Communications Service basically handled the administrative communications for the base. So after I left SAC, I went to AFCS on Anderson, and I worked for them. And I found out, because I was a good typist, and I was diligent in my work. That I got an opportunity to lead the communications center, which was shift work, and get a straight day job, which is great. And I worked in the traffic analysis section of the communications center, and that allowed me the opportunity for some promotions too. Now, at this particular time, the Vietnam was ready to wind down. It hadn't started to wind down yet, but it was ready to wind down. And there were a lot of individuals in the military who had done their time in Vietnam, and that's all they did was get the time there. They weren't motivated to do anything else. They weren't motivated for promotions or anything like that. And generally, if you made it to E5, which was a staff sergeant, then that was about where you were going to be, unless you had planned to stay in an extremely much longer time. Well, some of the guys who had been in had their problems, their issues. Vietnam was a difficult place to be. It was an extremely difficult place to be. And the guys who had been there had some issues when they came back. And me not having ever been there, I hadn't had an opportunity for promotions. And the Air Force came up with this new program called the WAPS system. It was a WAPS promotional system. It was a weighted airman promotion system. And they were trying to make it equal for promotions for some of the younger troops like myself and for some of the older guys that had been there for a while. And it was difficult for me to compete because I was so young in the military. Hadn't been in 4 years. I'd been in 3 years, and I was an E5 in 3 years. So I was kind of like on a fast track. And we had E5s that had 12, 15, 16 years time and grade, not just time in service, but time and grade. They had been a staff sergeant for that long. So it was difficult for me to compete with that. Less than 4 years in the military, and less than 3 years in time and grade. So it was difficult for me to get promoted at that particular time once I made E5. But I did my time on Guam. It was an 18-month tour duty. Seemed like 18 years. But I did my time on Guam, and it's kind of like what it was doing time too. But no, it was, I had my good times and my bad times while I was there. And when it was time for me to go my next duty station, I was able to get back to Kansas City because I was stationed at Richard Bar. And at that particular time, Richard Bar was being changed over. I'm not sure, I think it was an Air Training Command base, but it was being changed over to Air Force Communications Center headquarters. Well, me being a 291, which is AFC, which is Communications Center Specialist, excuse me, I was able to get stationed back there. So my first assignment there was working in the base communications center. And again, because I was a good typist, I was able to, over some tech sergeants who, I don't know if they were too happy about it, but I was able to get promoted to shift leader for what was called the, I can't remember the name of the shift that we were on. But actually what we did was, all we did was type messages. We didn't send messages, we didn't do anything like that. All we did was just type them. We sat on a typer machine, they'd bring all these messages in, and you type them up. And then at the end of the shift, they would have the people who operated the communication center would actually come and get the tapes, paper tapes, and actually transmit them. So all we had to do was type them and proofread them. And I somehow got to be the shift leader. And I was outranked by everybody that worked for me, really. I had less rank time of service than they did, but I was, for some reason, picked out to be the boss. And so I was the shift leader for that. That lasted for about a year and a half, actually. And then my next assignment was going to be the Philippines. I was supposed to be going to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. That was going to be a 18-month tour duty. because I had just reenlisted. I had reenlisted and got a $5,000 reenlistment bonus, which is pretty good. You know, when you're 23 years old, you know, it's not bad at all. So I got my reenlistment bonus, and then, like I said, had orders to go to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Well, I wasn't too particular happy about going, spend another 18 months in the Pacific. I felt like I had done my time in the Pacific. And at the last moment, an assignment came up, a 1-year assignment, which I'll never figure out how I got to be a 1-year assignment. And it was in Istanbul, Turkey. Well, actually, it was in Turkey. It was to be stationed in Turkey. And I found out, because of the type of security clearance that I had, that I would be attached to the State Department. So I had an opportunity to work for the American Consulate General when I was in Istanbul. And my career in Istanbul really started out on a rather strange note. I remember during the time that after I'd reenlisted, got my bonus, you know, young kids, you go out and you buy clothes and cars and stuff like that. And I had bought this white coat that was almost like a mink coat. It was a wraparound, and I had this white hat. And I don't know if you remember the movie Superfly, but Superfly was out at the time, and that's sort of like it was a maxi coat, a long coat, and a similar hat. And I wore that on the trip from the United States to Turkey. Well, when I got off the airplane, it was like a major shock, because first of all, they take you to a remote pad. You land at the airport, they take you to a remote pad. You don't get off and you don't deplane at the main terminal. So they took us to this remote pad. They pushed up the stairs to the airplane. That's when they still use stairs. And when you step out of the airplane, you look down and there's two army guys, Turkish army guys, with submachine guns on either side of the stairs. And you kind of thought, at least I kind of thought, what have I gotten myself into? Do I really want to be here under these circumstances? Because I had no idea that the military was like that. So, you know, we got off the airplane. They took us, we went into the main terminal. And when you walk into the main terminal, their main terminal was an aircraft hangar, actually. It was an aircraft hangar. And I don't know if you've ever been on the inside of an aircraft hangar, but they have these extremely big walls because they have to get airplanes inside, right? And on this huge wall, there is this huge kind of like poster, and it says, use drugs and go to jail. And I don't know if you know, but during that particular time, this was in the early 70s, the United States and Turkey were having major problems over the poppies. The farmers, the farmers grew poppies. That was their main culture, growing poppies. And poppies actually are used to produce drugs, morphine base, which is basically what they were used for. And a lot of that morphine base wasn't being used legally. It was being used illegally. And that's how the French Connection came about. They used to take and they used to transport the morphine base. It would be converted from poppies to morphine base in Turkey. Then the morphine base would be transported to basically Marseille, the port of Marseille. And that's how it would be transported out of the country into to the other various locations. And what happened was the American government decided to pay the Turkish government some money to stop growing the poppies, to kind of supplement their income, to stop the growth of the poppy seeds. And we gave the Turkish government the money, but guess what? The farmers never got the money. So the explanation that the government gave to the farmers was that the Americans never gave us the money. So naturally, there was a lot of bad blood between the Turkish people and the American government and the American people, because they figured they had been lied to. They were told they were going to get all this money if they stopped growing the poppies, and they didn't get a dime. They didn't get a dime. So it was things were really tough for Americans in Turkey at that particular time because of that. Um, there was one particular case that really came to the forefront during that time that really kind of told the whole story, and that was the story of Billy Hayes. Billy Hayes was an American tourist, and he and his girlfriend, and this transpired while I was over there, and he and his girlfriend were traveling in Turkey. And for some reason, Billy decides that he wants to smuggle some hash out of the country. And he tries to get on the airplane with it. And he probably had it made, except for the fact that when it was time to go to leave and go to get on the airplane itself, he was perspiring so bad that the Turkish police knew something was wrong. They didn't know what it was, but they knew something was wrong. So they pulled Billy Hayes out of line, and they found all this hash on him that he had packed around his waist and stuff. And Billy Hayes went to jail. Now, I don't know, I'm sure everybody realizes and understands that that was a difficult situation because it was something that the Turkish people wanted to make an example of Billy Hayes. You know, you tell us that you don't want these drugs in your country, and then you have one of your people, one of your citizens come over here and try to take advantage of us by smuggling these drugs out of the country back to his country. He's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. Well, I guess the American government felt a bit of responsibility for that because they eventually helped Billy Hayes escape from Turkish prison because he would have died there. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that he would have died in prison there. But that was a major event that took place. There were some other things that were going on around the world that sort of produced a lot of anti-American sentiment. I remember we used to some days go to work and there would be a group of protesters out in front of the American consulate. You knew something was going on if the gates were closed. And sometimes the gates would be closed. And we're trying to get in because we used to have a driver to come and pick us up and take us to work every day because when you worked for the American consulate, you lived on the economy. So you basically lived in the city itself. There was no military facilities there. They didn't have any barracks or anything like that. You had an apartment in the city. And so they used to send a driver to pick us up, to take us to work. And one morning we get to work and this group of Japanese protesters out in front. And they have this dummy slung over the fence and he's being burned in effigy. This is a protest against the American people. So we used to see things like that while I was there. But Turkey was probably the most amazing place that I've ever been because you get to see things that actually take you back to almost what you would consider the beginning of time. Because I had an opportunity to go and visit a dungeon. I actually went into a real dungeon that had actually been used to house prisoners. They had the shackles on the walls that were still there. That was amazing. You had an opportunity to visit a castle and stand on the. Turkey was vulnerable from a few spots, and one was from the Black Sea. And they had this location where you could go and you could stand on the top of this castle and look out, and you could look out over the Black Sea, and you could see what was coming. And that's how they protected their that part of the country, that part of the Turkish country. And I had an opportunity to do that. Took a vacation down to the southern coast of Turkey to Bodrum, which was a beautiful resort city. Stayed on the beach in a beach house on the beach. Got up every morning and went out and took a swim and go down to the cafe down the beach and have tea. and that was wonderful. Got a chance to go to the mountains while I was there. You could actually go from the beach to snow the same day. That's just how what that country was like. Uh, and There was just so much about Turkey that I loved. It really was. That was a major experience when you walk down the street and you think that this is probably one of the largest international cities in the world. And you don't know who's walking next to you. Is it just a plain old Turkish citizen? Is it a spy? Is it, you just didn't know. But that intrigue was always there because you never knew. You didn't know. Um, that was a wonderful time for me, the time in Turkey. That was probably my best time in the military, was that year spent in Turkey. Had a chance to meet some of the American diplomats because they were always having something at the consulate. The consulate general and I got to be pretty good friends, and it was only because of an incident that I was involved in. Now, I was the type of person when I went to a foreign country, I kind of maybe not right, but I kind of disassociated myself from the Americans. I became friends with the locals because if you're an American there, just like me, you can't do anything for me in this country. I don't want to hang out with you. I want to hang out with the people that are going to be able to help me survive in this country. And that was the locals. So all of my friends were Turks. They used to work in the consulate as interpreters and switchboard operators and just various jobs in the consulate. So those are who my friends were. My friends were the Turks. That's why I never learned to speak Turkish, because I never had to. My friends were always there with me, and they spoke English, and so anything I needed, they always translated for me. But it was great. I remember one time going to a Turkish bar, and you see these things on TV where you go down to this Turkish bar and it's kind of go down these steps, and it's dark and smoky in there, and you have the music playing and the belly dancers. Well, I actually had an opportunity to see that because that's exactly the way it was. That's exactly the way it was. And it was just a magnificent experience. It was really different. Then after I did my time in Turkey, and I had some other things that went on there that were not great, but I won't talk about those. But then after I did my year in Istanbul, and my next assignment was back to Richard Scabar again. And I spent the remaining portion of my military career at Richard Scabar. And I actually went to, when I got back, I started working in the communications center. And then I got a job working at AFCS headquarters. I worked in headquarters. We were in network integrations, is what it was called. And actually, I was part of myself and actually the gentleman that I worked for. He was a rifted captain who came back into the same job as a GS-11. So he got, and I don't know if you know what rifted means, but that's a reduction in force. That basically means that you couldn't make ranks, so you can't stay. You got to go. So he was rifted, and then he came back and got the same job as a civilian GS-11. So he actually came out better. The guy made more money. He was going to still be able to retire with a government pension. Didn't have to wear a uniform. So he basically, he made out pretty good. But anyway, he and I, we set up the United States Air Force facsimile network, and I was part of the startup of that. What they were doing is the Air Force facsimiles were becoming really prominent during that time. There was a lot of stuff being sent via fax. And so what these different organizations were doing on base is they would go out, if they needed a fax machine, they'd go out and they requisition a fax machine. Well, one person may get a Xerox and another another office may get a different brand, and they found out that, well, guess what? My brand can't communicate with your brand. So what they wanted to do was the Air Force wanted to set it up where no matter what type of communications you were in, you would be able to communicate with various other fax machines throughout the Air Force. They initially called it proliferation because they were being proliferated by the various offices. So they wanted to discontinue that. So they set up everything in a central location, which was Richard Scabar at AFCS headquarters and in our department. And so we got that program off the ground, got it up and running, and I'm sure it still exists, to tell you the truth. So that was something I was pretty proud of, to be a part of that initial program, get that whole program started for the United States Air Force. Then I found out, well, Robert, 4 years later, after I had made staff sergeant, I was still a staff sergeant. And I was extremely disappointed because I knew that I was going to be able to make rank faster than that. Well, I was talking to a gentleman who was, he was a tech sergeant in that worked for AFCS also. But he was in another branch of the of network integrations, and they were actually starting up. It was a new program that they were starting up to. It involved long landlines, and it was really a new career field, and promotions were coming left and right in that career field. So I said, he said, Robert, he said, if you want to get promoted and if you want to make it to chief master before you get out, this is where you want to come. You want to come and work in this department. Well, I applied to cross train, and unfortunately, the gentleman who was our department head, he was at GS-13. He and the communications department headquarters was chief was a colonel, full-bird colonel, and apparently they felt that I was too important to that department to be able to transfer. And that's when my love affair with the Air Force ended, because I said, they're going to be selfish enough to keep me here and not allow me to transfer to further my career, then I don't want any part of it. And it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face, because I never should have did what I did, but I actually got out. I left the military, and that was in February of 1977. And that was the reason why I left. I left because they refused to allow me to cross-train. Because I felt that, why am I going to be here if I can't get as high as I'm able to go? Because someone, not because of what I'm doing, it's because of what someone else is not allowing me to do. And I found out that was going to be the first of more than one disappointment I had, in my life, dealing with situations like that. So that was basically my military career. And then after I left the military, my mother had just remarried and moved to Southern California. I had been to Southern California to visit, and I just fell in love with it. So I wanted to go back. So I just packed up my bags, threw them in the back seat of my car, and took off for Los Angeles. And same day I got discharged, actually. I actually beat the snow out of town because that was on the way, and I was headed for Southern California. And that was my next stop, Southern California. I spent 13 years there, but my first real experience came when I went to when I was applying for a job. Now, keep in mind, like I say, I had all these various types of security clearances, and I mean, these were probably because in addition to the PSYOP and to the crypto, then I got that State Department security clearance too, because they sent out the FBI again to do some background on me once I was going to work for the State Department, separate from what the military had already done. Excuse me. So I had that State Department clearance too. Well, there was an organization in Southern California called TRW, and TRW had a lot of government contracts. They worked real close with the military and had a lot of government contracts. So naturally, there was a lot of communications between them and the military. And me, with having a military background and having all these military clearances, uh, I found out that they had a position that was open to run the communications center. I was going to actually be the superintendent of the communications center. And I talked to an individual at TRW on the telephone, and boy, after I talked to him, he says, you know, you're exactly what we're looking for. We want to meet you in person. Come down and see us. I went down to see them, and I think they were a little surprised to see who I was and what I was, because the interview consisted of a few words and then we'll get back to you. And that was as far as that interview went. And I'll never believe anything other than the fact that because I was an African American, I didn't get that job. And that was the only reason why, because I was more than qualified for that job. So that was my first encounter with civilian life after time in the military. Because during my time in the military, you know, the 60s were a really turbulent time. The 60s and early 70s were really turbulent time. A lot of social issues in this country and around the world, really, a lot of social issues. And race was one of those social issues that was pretty prominent during that time. And the military, I remember, was probably one of the first groups, organizations to really address it, because they were aware of the fact that, you know, if you are going to fight next to someone, you have to be able to trust that someone, regardless of the color of his skin or his religion or anything like that. You have to be able to trust that individual because your life could possibly depend on that individual. And so they sent us to race relation classes, and it really helped too. It really did help. So the military was actually the first ones to take the bull by the horns and sort of like run with that philosophy. And once I got out of the military, I found that there were some other organizations, major companies that were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to, because they had the same issues. I worked for a number of, actually a few really large, extremely large companies. I worked for Continental Airlines, who I retired from, and I worked for a Danish steamship company called Maersk Line. It was, and it's a worldwide company, headquartered in Denmark, Copenhagen, owned by an individual, A.P. Moeller. And they did the same thing also. Customer service and race was a big thing then, because after the Vietnam War, things got pretty competitive as far as the business world went, and they needed to be able to be able to get business from all sectors, and so that was a major part of my training too. And like I say, fortunately, I don't know if it was a gift that I had, that I was able to kind of relate with different people. I found out, and this was from a class that I went to with Continental Airlines, that every individual that we come in contact with has a need. And your job is to find out what that individual's need is. And once you satisfy that individual's need, you can get anything you want. And it's true. It's true. Some people need to be told that they're great and they're good. And if you keep telling them that, they're going to love you to death because you're telling them what they want to hear. Some people need for you to tell them that they're not very good at their job because they feel that they have to be, that pushes them to do better. But yeah, I found out, like I said, that everybody has a need. And if you're able to satisfy that need, you can get anything from that person that you want. And that carried me through a lot of different situations by just being able to read people and being able to know how to get that information from them. Because a lot of times it's not readily readily available to you, so you have to kind of dig for it. And once you find out how to dig for it, and once you find out what it is, you got them. You got them. But it's I retired from Continental Airlines right after 9/11, and I did a few other things. I worked with the Boy Scouts because my son is an Eagle Scout, and I never had an opportunity to participate in scouting programs when I was a kid because we couldn't afford it. Simple as that. We just couldn't afford to be a part of a scouting program. So my scouting was done with my son. I used to take the trips with him. We'd go to Camp Barlow and spend those 10 days and 9 nights down in the down in the woods, and which I never had a chance to do. I never had an opportunity to do that. I became an adult leader. I became a member of the tribe, an honorary member of the tribe. So I'm an honorary member of Tribe of Mickasay, which is part of the scouting program in Missouri. And so I did that in schools. I worked in the school system as an adult leader. We would have scouting programs for some of the younger kids, less fortunate schools, in after schools, and that was part of the after school program. And I did that for a while. Then I actually was injured while I was in the military. It wasn't a war accident or anything like that. I broke my foot playing basketball, but the injury still bothers me sometimes because it never healed properly. So I took some time out from work for disability because I came to work for the college as a part-time custodian. It might have been 2013, 2012, 11, something like that. And I worked here 3 years, and then I decided that I couldn't handle it because I was physically unable to because of my lower extremities, and that's where the injury took place when I broke my foot. So I went out on disability, and I was out until actually a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. And then I decided that I needed to do something because things just weren't great being retired when you don't have anything that you want to do as you do. So a lot of time in front of a computer, in front of a TV, and you don't really get out and take care of yourself physically like you should. So I said, well, it's time to go back to work. And fortunately enough, I left in good standing with the college, and I was able to come back and start to work here again. And everybody keeps asking me how long am I going to work. So as long as I'm able to get up and come every day, I'm going to continue to do it because it kind of it keeps you going. It really keeps you going because you can get stifled when you don't do anything, when you just sit around and, your life just dies. You die, basically, doing that. And I just wasn't ready to do that. So I decided to come back to work. And like I say, I'm here and I enjoy getting up, coming to work every day. I hate to get up at 3:30 in the morning to come here at 5 o'clock, but I love when I get off at 10 in the morning and go home. So it's really been good for me. That basically covers probably about the last 50 years of my life.
Yeah?
Yeah.
In a nutshell?
Yeah, in a nutshell, that's it.
Well, we're glad you came back, Robert. I enjoy seeing you every morning. Okay, so I have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
We'll start back at the beginning. Were you born in Kansas City?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Kansas City. Yeah, my parents, my father actually moved here from Mississippi. He used to work in the cotton fields in Mississippi. His father was a slave. My grandmother was actually a Saudi national. Yeah, my grandmother was a Saudi national, and unfortunately, she was disowned by her family when she married my grandfather. But that was the way it was during those times. Some things transpired down in Mississippi that forced them to have to leave. And so they moved to Kansas City. And my grandfather passed away. My grandmother lived on, and we we were actually one of the first African American families to move to where I stayed. I stayed on 35th in Brooklyn, and we were actually the first African American family to move into that neighborhood. This was in 1955, and so I grew up there. I spent all of my time there from 55 until 1968, when I left and went to the military. You know, that was my home. And then, like I say, after that, my military service, and I was just kind of like all over after that, because I've lived at various. I've lived in Denver. I lived in Denver for 7 years. I lived in Southern California for 13. And then I moved back to Kansas City in 1997. My son's mother passed away, so I became a single parent. And I felt that the most important thing was to be able to help to raise my son. So I left Denver because I was working there for Continental. I left there, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get a position here with Continental to keep my job. So yeah, so that worked out real well for me.
Well, that was kind of my next question. You mentioned your son several times, which leads me to believe that at some point there was a woman.
Yes, actually there was. We were sweethearts from the 11th grade until she passed away in 1997. Our son was born in Southern California, and that was one of my main reasons for going back to Southern California too. After I got out of the military, was because she was there. And my son was born there in 1990, and yeah, that would have put me at 40 years old when I became a parent for the first time. And she was diagnosed with cancer in 1990 after he was born. And I used to work in reservations for Continental at the time, and they were closing the reservation facility down in Southern California. So I was going to have to leave, and I chose Denver. So we didn't have any family or any relatives or anything like that in Denver, and she needed help with my son. So she moved back to Kansas City, and she was able to move next door to where her mother lived, so she could have some help with my son, because I couldn't get back to Kansas City to work, and I had to keep that job with Continental. I invested too much time in it. And so in 1997, when she passed away, my son was 7 years old, and that's when I decided, well, I didn't have a choice. If I have to find a job, I'll just go find another job, because I had to be here to raise my son. So I guess I made a pretty good impression on some of the people at Continental's headquarters in Houston, Texas, because the lady that I was working with when I was going through all these different things with my son's mother, with her sickness, with her illness, she was able to get me transferred back to Kansas City and get me to the airport. So I worked at Air Freight department in Continental Airlines at the airport. And that's where I retired from. My son has since graduated from college. Told Dad that, Dad, when you get old and decrepit, you always got a place to stay. Huh? Emporia State.
Nice.
Yeah, Emporia State.
Is he still local?
Yeah, he lives in Lenexa right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he lives in Lenexa. 20, I guess it'll be 28. 28 next month. Yeah, so he's
So that was kind of boom, boom, huh? He was born and then,
yeah,
and it was like right immediately.
yeah. That's when she was diagnosed, and and it was so unfortunate because of the way it had gone was because when she went to the doctor, she was having some back problems after he was born, and the doctor told her, well, you're 40 years old, you're getting old. Well, 40 years old is not old. That's not old. That don't precipitate back problems just because you turn 40 years old. She, like I said,
I want to tell my back that.
huh? Well, she actually left. So, like I said, she left Southern California. She came back to Kansas City, and she wasn't here for 2 weeks before she went to Truman Medical Center and they diagnosed the cancer. She had what was called multiple myeloma, and myeloma cancers are, there's no cure for myeloma cancer, or at least there wasn't then. I'm not sure what the situation is now, but and they were just about ready to try a new procedure too, when before she passed away, but she never got a white blood cell count back to where it needed to be for them to perform the procedure. And what they were going to do was they were going to take all the bone marrow out of her bones, clean it, basically wash it and clean it, and then put it back in. But like I said, she never got healthy enough to have that done, or strong enough to have that done to her. So she passed away at 97. But he's grown up to be quite the guy. I'm proud of him. Proud of him.
So you guys were, you two were sweethearts since 11th grade. Where is she during this military service?
She is actually in Kansas City. She's in Kansas City. We kind of lost touch with each other for a while. We didn't really lose touch, but it wasn't like it was when we were in high school. Because in high school, we were inseparable. I mean, if one day I called over to her house to talk to her, her mother said, well, Robert, you can't talk to her today. You talk to her every day this week. You can't talk to her today. Call her back tomorrow. That's just how it was between us. And so she spent her time in Kansas City while I was in the military, and then right at the end of my military service time, she moved to Southern California. So that's why I ended up in Southern California too. Yeah.
So on ETS day, when you had them bags packed,
Mm-hmm.
your destination really wasn't to go see your family.
Actually, the thing about it was, now you have to remember, I was stationed in Kansas City when I was discharged, so I had no bags to pack. All I did was drive from Richards Gabar to my home on 71st and Agnes, and that was it for me. And I had gone to Southern California to visit because my mother had moved there the year before. After she had gotten a divorce, she had moved there the year before, and I was fortunate enough to be able to ride out there with her when she went out there, and so I got a chance to spend a little time there, a couple of weeks there, while I was on leave, and I fell in love with it. I mean, just the atmosphere. Plus Diane was there too. That was her name, Diane. Diane was there also, so it made it a lot easier to take it too. And when I got my discharge in '77, I just loaded up my car, and I was off to, not kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies, but I guess it was kind of like a scenario. I loaded up my car and moved to Southern California.
So when you went in '69,
Mm-hmm.
and as you had said, your family was one of the first African American families in your neighborhood when you moved in,
Mm-hmm.
But being part of the the African American community in Kansas City, what was kind of your sentiment towards going into service prior to going in, and your feelings towards it, or
I really didn't have any, and I'll tell you, I was going to go. You were during that time. If you didn't go to college, you were going to the military. Simple as that. So it's not like well, I want to go and I want to serve my country and stuff like that. It's either you go, or you leave the country. And like I said, I wasn't leaving the country. I attempted college, and for some reason, I just couldn't do it. And I did well in high school. I graduated in the top 10%. And since we had an extremely large senior class that year too, and I graduated in the top 10%, I was recruited by more than one college as an academic student. I actually went to McPherson, and I packed up all my bags, moved down to McPherson, Kansas, went to classes for a week, and came back to Kansas City because I didn't like it. I didn't like it. And, during that particular time, there was only one, two, three, four, five African Americans on campus. Two were seniors, and three were two and myself all graduated at the same year from the same high school, from Central in '68. Uh, and I don't know, it just wasn't for me, I would guess. And so I came back to Kansas City, and I tried to go to Metropolitan Community College. I tried to go to UMKC, and those two. And I went to class for one day, and that was it. I don't know. It was something about I spent so much time in the classroom, and I worked hard when I was in high school. I worked hard to get where I got, and to get the grades that I got. I worked hard, and so it was just something that I felt I didn't want to do anymore. You know, I wanted to do something different, and so like I say, when I went to when it came to the military, I knew that I don't want to be running through the jungle, chasing some guy, trying to shoot him, and I didn't even know who he was. It just wasn't going to be for me. And so I remember the Air Force recruiter coming in talking about the delayed enlistment program, and that's when I decided that's what I really needed to do. And I think that's because at that particular point in time, that was my only choice. That was the only choice I had. You know, I mean, the other two were not options.
What was your family's opinion or sentiment at the time? What were they telling you?
Well, my mother and my father both told me, you have to do something. Simple as that. You have to do something. And if going to the Air Force is what you want to do, then do it. They're both deceased now, but they always did that for us. They said, whatever you want to pursue, go ahead and pursue it. You can't stay here if you don't work or if you don't go to school. So you got to do one or the other. I didn't want to go to school, and I knew I couldn't work because if I went to work, I was going to get drafted. So really, the military was really my only option. Yeah, that was basically my only option. And at the time, I never really thought of it. And I had no negative thoughts about the military. I really didn't. You know, Vietnam was actually the first war that was fought on TV. And that's what was so tragic about that. That was the first war that was fought on TV. Because I remember coming in from school every day. And this like I say, these things influenced me and my decision to go to the Air Force. I would come home from school, and you'd turn on the TV, and the first thing you see is one of the news reporters in Vietnam live doing a broadcast with the bombs going off in the background. And you know, so it was real. It wasn't like maybe, you know, during World War II or Korea when you were so distant from the war. You know, you may have done things back in the States to help the war effort, but you were distant from the fighting. Vietnam brought the fighting into our living rooms. They brought the fighting, they brought the war, the actual war, and death into your living room every day. And it was a part of everyday life. And but it never influenced. It never influenced my. The only thing that influenced for me was the branch of service and how I went in, because I knew I didn't want to fight. I wasn't a fighter. Simple as that. Actually, the only time I ever shot a weapon was when I was in basic training. I had to do. We had to qualify. That was the only time I ever shot a weapon.
You had discussed how social issues were you know hot buttons during this time period.
Yeah.
And with your journey both starting and ending in Kansas City, how do you feel like you know the military, one, shaped your perspective, and two, may have do you feel like you were treated any differently for being a military member, or maybe how did that affect that for you and your journey?
I don't really think it did. I don't think it affected my journey in any way. I only have positive remembrances and positive thoughts about my time in the military. it's hard for me to find anything negative about that time,
I mean, from
about
a
that period of
community
time.
though, as far
Um,
as the way that maybe they perceive you or how you played into those social issues.
I don't. I guess it's because uh, I didn't live in the community because when I first came back to Kansas City, I actually moved. My first place of residence in Kansas City was on 39th and Harrison. Now, back in the 60s, African Americans basically didn't live west of Truce. Well, Harrison was west of Truce. So I was one of the first in that particular area. When I came back to Kansas City from Guam, I'm not from Guam, but from Turkey, I moved to Grandview. And I was the only African American that lived in the complex in Grandview, in the apartment complex that I lived in. So things were kind of like a first for me. And so I'd never really had a problem with the neighborhoods. One of the things about it is my family, and this goes back from basically my mother's side of the family. They were extremely close. We spent all of our time together. When we were kids, we grew up and we spent all of our time together. And so that was like my community. My community was my family. That's who we hung out with. That's who we did things with. So everybody else was kind of like on the outside of that. So you never had any problems with those issues because these were your family members. And like I said, during that particular time, your other family members were basically in the same situation you were in. The male members were anyway. You either go to the military or go to school. And that was it. I had a cousin that went to the Navy. I had a cousin that went to the Marines. And I had a cousin that went to the Army. My brother went to the Air Force. So, we all spent time in the military. And that's kind of, and we, right now, that's all a part of our background was our military service, you know.
So does that kind of create some camaraderie then, like across the family? You guys have some.
Nah, not really. You know what? Our camaraderie was initiated by my mother's mother, and that's when she had 3 daughters, my mother's 2 sisters, and my mother, and they would get together. My grandmother would have them get together at her house once a week, usually on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and one of the things she told them, if you come, bring your kids. And if you're not bringing your kids, don't come. I'm serious. That was my grandmother. She said, if you come, you bring your kids. And if you don't bring your kids, you don't come. Simple as that. And so all the sisters came, and all the sisters came with their kids. So we grew up together. I had a cousin that would come to my house. He lived in Kansas. He would come to my house the day school was out, and my father would take him back home the day before school was ready to start. This was over the summertime. And this is how we grew up. This was a yearly event. This is what we did. So we actually grew up like brothers, basically. And it continues on today. It really continues on today. Just that close.
I'm gonna ask you a question about Guam.
Mm-hmm.
So you say it's 30? You say 35 square miles?
35 square miles, yeah.
What did you do for recreation on 35 square miles?
Well, actually, well, first of all, every military installation has an NCO club, which is the focal point of the facility, of the area, really, the civilian area and the military area. The NCO club. Second of all, they had all type of sports programs that you can get involved in. So I broke my foot playing basketball in like an intramural program. I played football. I played softball. So they have plenty of things to keep you busy. They really do. They have plenty of things to keep you busy. I used to visit some friends that live downtown because like I say, you know, when I was at locations out of this country, I kind of gravitated toward the locals, not the other military people on the base or whatever. I used to gravitate to the locals, so I knew some locals, and we would hang out. I even went to a barbecue up in the jungle. Matter of fact, I was over there during the time where there was a Japanese soldier that actually came out of the jungles of Guam that had been there since the end of World War II, and he had no idea that the war was over. Yeah, he had been in the jungle, and that's just how overgrown with jungle that island was, to be such a small island.
Mm-hmm. So at the end of Turkey,
Mm-hmm.
you said there were some things. Let's not talk about those. Come on now, you gotta tell us a little bit about.
Well, I don't know. When you're in a place like Turkey, you actually there are certain things that the locals don't have access to that you do as a military member. You have access to the BX, access to the commissary, and if you know the right people, you can actually make a few extra dollars. You know, buying some things at the local PX and then you know, making them available to some of the locals. So that helped to finance my trips in while I was in Turkey. Some of my trips to the mountains and down to sea. Yeah, so that was basically what it was. You know.
When you were in Turkey, and maybe also Guam, I know that completely different. You're out of the country, but they're completely different, you know, scenarios. Yeah. What was communication with your family like?
When I was on Guam, see, one of the advantages you have of working in communications is communications. So you can communicate with people. I had friends that were radio operators. You know, you could plug into a circuit and you could go directly to an Air Force base in the United States. And when you did that, all you could do is just patch you through to somebody's house if you wanted to talk to somebody on the phone. Turkey, it was a little bit more difficult than that because of the number of people you had to go through to communicate. But yeah, so that's basically what I did was, you know, and wrote letters. Letters were not as frequent as they probably should have been, but just pick up the phone, call somebody, you know.
So during this time frame,
No, you know what? I was actually calling up my mother and my father. That's who I communicated with. See how my family was. Yeah.
So when you so now this is about Turkey again. You walk in to this hangar and you got this big old drug posters everywhere.
Yeah.
And what's going through your head at that point? You're like, oh.
Don't mess with drugs. Simple as that.
Yeah. Were you aware of the drug problem prior to that?
No, not really. I don't think I was. Not really. And maybe subconsciously I was, but not. I wasn't overly conscious of the fact that, you know. But see, the thing about it is working for the State Department. I worked closely. Some of my best friends were DEA agents, you know, and so they kind of gave you an idea of what was going on in the country. Yeah. You know, you had an idea of what was going on and places not to go, and just really what how the drugs were affecting the country, because you know, at that particular time, cocaine was really one of the major drugs in cocaine and heroin, two major drugs in the United States at that particular time, and both developed from morphine base. So you know, you knew they had the movies out, the French Connection. It was a movie that came out, and you know, it felt like, you know, I was actually a part of that, because I was right there in Istanbul, you know, where a lot of the stuff used to take place. and that city has such an international flavor to it. You know, there was I've spent time in New York before, but to me, New York is just different. And I guess it's because, you know, you hear people around you and you know what the conversation is about because they're speaking English. Well, when you go to a country like Turkey and you're walking around, people aren't speaking English. They're speaking either their native language or they're speaking Turkish. And so it gives it more of an international flavor than it would, even though New York is just a major international, it's just as much of a major international city as Istanbul is. And did you know that Istanbul is the only city that's located on two different continents? Yeah, it's on Asia and Europe. It's one of the first things I found out about that when I moved there.
So, was it in Guam? Is that where you were working for the bombing brigade?
Yeah, I worked for the, actually, it wasn't a bombing brigade, it was actually a brigade's army. Delivers brigades to an Air Force guy. A squadron, there you go. But anyway, yeah, actually, I didn't work for them. I worked for communications. But we were attached to the director of operational planning, who used to plan the bombing missions from Thailand and from Vietnam. Yeah, because they used to fly bombing missions out of Thailand as well as out of Vietnam during that particular time, and that's when the bombing missions were really heavy during that particular time too.
So, you know, you're preparing these fragmentary orders, and
Yeah.
and those fragmentary orders operate under an operational order,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So prior to you starting, prior to writing these fragmentary orders, were you aware of the operation order?
Well,
Were you, I mean, you're briefed in on that? Like
no. Actually, all we do is we type. That's all we're there for is typists. The guys who plan the bombing missions and stuff like that, they don't sit on a typewriter and type up these frag orders. It's actually just a piece of paper. Actually, it's a number of pieces of paper, and they fill in the blanks, and you just type what they fill in, basically. You just type what they, and they usually all there is coordinates, and the number of MiGs that might be in the area. MiGs were Russian fighter planes, so you had to let them know how many MiGs were in the area, and what the longitude and latitude were for the bombs. That was basically it.
So my question is, if you weren't overly familiar with the operations order, the first time you get one of these frag orders to type up, did it kind of hit you like, I'm typing up a bombing mission?
I never thought of it that way. I'm doing my job. You know, I never thought of it being as a bombing mission. I'm just doing my job. That's all I'm doing. My job is to sit here and type, and that's what I'm doing, sitting here typing.
So you were pretty much able to disassociate with the other end of that.
Yeah, with the emotional portion of it. Yeah.
Because for all intents and purposes, that was your combat. I mean, that was.
Yeah, it was.
Those fragos were your bullets.
That's right. They were my bullets. You're absolutely. That's the reason why when I remember when I started this stuff, I said, even though I never spent one day in Southeast Asia, I felt that I was a major part of the Vietnam War, and it was because of that. Yeah. Yeah, that was a large portion of the combat, and the thing that really did was it opened my eyes about the Vietnam War and how it was being fought, because it was a political war. That's my own personal opinion, but it was a political war. We could have actually gone in, bombed Vietnam off the map, and just won the war and walked away with a win. But because of some political issues, we were not able to do that, and therefore it drug on and on and on. A lot of, from what I feel, useless deaths, because I don't know if anybody ever kept track of it. I'm sure they have somewhere, but a number of our dead soldiers was from friendly fire, which is horrible. But I guess it's all part of it. But and they were useless deaths as far as I'm concerned. They were, but we had a reason to be there because we wanted to maintain presence there, and we knew at that particular time, the Cold War was still going strong between us and Russia, and that's who during Vietnam. That's who our main adversary was. It wasn't really the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. It was against the Russians. That's what this was all about.
Working in communications, and it sounds like you had worked for some higher commands.
Yeah.
And then again at the embassy.
Yeah.
You're obviously aware of this Cold War going on.
Yeah.
What did you think about that, or did you ever feel like there was that danger out there?
I don't know, because like it's kind of like I said, before. It was my job. It was just a job. To me, it was a job. And once I left that job, I forgot all about the military and I forgot all about the wars and all that kind of stuff. As far as I was concerned, I was a civilian once I took that uniform off. And I only wore my uniform during the hours that I was at work. So the rest of the time, as far as I was concerned, I was just a civilian. Because I did civilian stuff, I lived off base. I only spent a small portion of my time on Guam. I lived on base. I had a room in the barracks, but I never stayed there. I had a place downtown that I stayed. And when I got back to Richards Bar, I had room on base, but I never stayed there. I lived downtown. I was from Kansas City, so there was no reason for me. So basically, I was a civilian. As far as I was concerned, I was a civilian, just doing a military job. Because to me, it wasn't like being in the Air Force. It was like getting up, going to work. And I just instead of putting on this uniform, I put on a military uniform when I went to work. When I took it off, I'm not JCCC when I don't have this uniform on. So when I get home, I'm just Robert. And that's the way it was when I was in the military. When I get home, take that uniform off, I'm just Robert. I don't know, maybe, I don't know how I was able to disassociate the two, but I just did. I did. Never had any problems with my conscience about some of the things that transpired over there because, I kind of knew that when it came to what was going on between the countries, that they would have shot me just as quickly as I would have shot them. So, that's part of it. Just the way it goes. Excuse me.
So you served more than one enlistment.
Yeah.
Do you ever wish you would have gotten out sooner or transversely stayed in longer?
I guess it's because I, at the time, just after the time that I did it, I realized it was a dumb move to get out. I let my emotions get the best of me because I was mad. I was mad because they wouldn't allow me to cross-train, and I felt that if I was going to be in the military, I had to be a chief master sergeant when I got out. Otherwise, it was useless to stay there. If I was going to stay for 20 years and be a staff sergeant, why not? Why would I want to do that? Not make any progress at all. And the prospects of my career field, that was highly possible. That I would have stayed for 20 years and still been a staff sergeant when I got out. I mean, I would have spent 16 years as a staff sergeant, which to me doesn't make sense. Not when I made staff sergeant with less than 4 years. I was under 3 years when I made staff sergeant. 3 years time in the service. So I was fast tracking. And that's what I wanted to do. I worked for it. I deserved it. They didn't give me anything. The military didn't give me anything. All they gave me was the incentive. And so I worked hard for what I got. And I knew that if I worked hard, I could get where I wanted to go, if they had allowed me to. But they didn't allow me to. They basically told me, well, you can't do that. Well, if I can't do it, then I'm out of here. I'll see you later. Then now see how you get along without me. That was basically my attitude when they said, you can't get along without me in the department. Well, if I'm out of the military, you're still gonna have to get along without me. And that was the thing that really upset me so, was the fact that either they didn't care about that or they weren't smart enough to realize and understand that we can't force you to stay here because you always have the option of getting out. And that's really what kind of turned me against the whole situation when I really thought about that. To think that either they didn't particularly care or they weren't smart enough to realize and understand it. Now, if you're not smart enough to realize and understand that you can't force me to stay here, why are you wearing the oak leaf and the star and I'm wearing stripes? when I'm smart enough to realize and understand that, are we in the wrong spots? Should you be wearing the stripes and should I be wearing the oak leaf or the eagle?
Yeah, I think often there's a disconnect between officers and what soldiers need.
Yeah, yeah. And not only what they need, but as soldiers, but as people. As people. I'm a person, and I have ambitions, and that's what the military needs. It needs people with ambitions, and people that have goals and want to achieve those goals, and want to go about achieving them the right way, which is what I was willing to do. I was willing to work for anything that I got. And I'll tell you right now that nobody's giving me anything. Everything I got, I worked hard for. And that I learned at an early age. My father taught me at an early age that hard work is what gets you what you want and what you need. That's to do it. That's the way to do it, hard work. And so I was willing to put in the hard work. And I figured that I put it in.
Do you feel like the things you learned in the military and the regiment and seeing the different things around the world impacted who you were as a father?
No. My father impacted me, the most in my fatherhood, because there couldn't have been a better father. As simple as that. He was all a father could be, to tell you the truth. He worked hard to provide for his family. He was there for us when he needed you. He supported you in your efforts, and he was compassionate because my father was like a neighborhood father. My father used to he used to buy a station wagon. Now there was only 4 of us kids at the time. So you don't really need a station wagon with 4 kids. You can put 4 kids in the back seat of those old 50s cars, with no problem at all. But he would buy a station wagon just to make sure that he had sufficient room for the kids in the neighborhood and for my cousins to go whenever we got ready to go somewhere, because that's the type of father he was. He was a neighborhood father. And that really influenced me because I was kind of the same way too. As I kind of moved into my fatherhood, I coached my son's baseball team because I like to be around the kids. Helped coach the football team. The kids just come over my house to play because they know they could go, and Mr. Robbins wouldn't give them a hard time, but he'd make them do what they were supposed to do. Simple as that. But I wouldn't give them a hard time, and that was from my father. He was my role model. And I look at some of these other people out here, and they say, "Well, this baseball player, this basketball player is my role model." I didn't need no basketball player, no baseball player to be my role model. My father was.
It's funny, you pass somebody in the hallway every day, and we've talked, and I knew you're an Air Force veteran and stuff, but you don't really get into the details of it.
Yeah.
Hear someone tell a story. It's interesting, all the things you've done and been a part of. It's really amazing. I want to thank you for coming here and sharing that story with us.
I like to think that I had a real interesting life. I've enjoyed every moment of it, and I've lived it. So that's what makes it special to me, is I've lived it, and I don't regret anything that I've done or anything that's happened. I feel like I've been really blessed, and that's what's important. That's what's important.
So now we've been blessed for you.
And well, I'm glad I was able to do that, and I hope I was able to do it in a way that people were able to understand what I was trying to get across.
Do you, um, you- is there anything we've left out? Do you feel like we've?
You know what? Uh, I'm 68 years old, so I've lived a pretty long while. I've done a lot of things. I've seen a lot of things, um, and you know, it's hard to sit down and put your entire life into a conversation because there's so much of it. And I feel that I've actually been able to live life, which is good. Which is good. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. That I've been able to do that. So I don't know. You know, like I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good about it. And you can tell I enjoy talking about it. I do. I enjoy talking about it because those are memories and those are things that nobody can ever take from you. And those are good memories. Matter of fact, I guess over the past week or so, I listen to Pandora a lot. You know, I don't know if you ever get up on the third floor GEB, you'll hear the music playing around the men's restrooms. Well, that's me. And this week, I have been playing music from the late 60s and early 70s just to get me into this frame of mind. you know, and I've enjoyed it. I'll sit down. I'm not only listening to music from today, not very much of it, because I'm a smooth jazz person, but I periodically will go back and listen to music from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and those were the prominent years in my life. You know, we got to the 90s, kind of things. You started to get older, and you know, you had to act older. You had to act your age when you got to when you get at that particular position. But you know, people sort of overlook you when you're younger and you kind of do stuff you're not supposed to do. Well, that's because of his age. But once you get to be a certain age, that doesn't fly anymore. You got to start acting your age. Yeah, which is I guess it's good. You know. Yeah, accountability. Yeah, yeah. A little. Yeah, so no. Like I say, I lived a wonderful life, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. You know, the people that I've come in contact with, just the places that I've been able to go and to see, and the military. The thing that I really love the military force because it gave me those opportunities. I would have never been able to sit down and have dinner with an ambassador. I wouldn't. You know, I mean, had it not been for the State Department. Who was like the single most interesting person? Oh boy, who is the single most interesting person? My God.
Or maybe maybe not necessarily interesting person that stands out most, or
Oh. Well, I guess it was Ambassador Mace. Not ambassador, but he was a consul general. Isn't he Howard P. Mace? And that's because Mr. Mace had some difficult situations come up. He actually should have been an ambassador. He was never able to achieve that ambassadorship because of some political things that had happened, and political things that were not his fault. And he basically was a scapegoat, so he was never able to be that ambassador. And I was involved in an incident when I was in Turkey. It basically almost turned into a major international incident. Actually, I was like I say, I used to hang around with the Turks all the time, and there was a hotel in Istanbul that we used to go to all the time. It had a casino in the basement and had a disco on the roof. It was called Disco 9000, and we used to go down to the we used to go to the disco first, and then we go down to the casino after the disco closed and gamble. Well, we were at this hotel one night, and Turkey was it's different for the military there because there actually are no military, or there were no military bases there. They were just detachments. And it had something to do with the Turkish government and the rules or the laws or something like that. So we belonged to an organization called JUSMAT, Joint U.S. Military Assistance to Turkey. And during that particular time, like I say, the Cold War was still going strong, and there were locations on the eastern border of Turkey and the western border of Russia. You know, they border each other, and we used to have radar sites there, and that's how we used to spy on the Russians from those radar sites. Well, they would bring these guys in, these army guys in. They'd have to go to those radar sites. These were remote sites now. They would have to be there 6 months before they could take a leave and go on R&R someplace. So after being out at these remote sites for 6 months, you tend to get a little crazy when you get away from it. And one night, this friend of mine, his name was Atesh, I'll never forget it. Atesh, his father was a lawyer. So he was an interpreter for the consulate. So he was pretty prominent. And we were good friends. We were real close friends. And Atesh and I had been up on the disco, and we were on our way down. And these army guys got on the elevator with us. And they were drunk. They were just drunk. And they started to making derogatory comments about the Turkish government. Now, in Turkey, you can go to prison for that. You don't publicly make derogatory remarks about the country, and you can end up going to prison for that. And Turks are extremely nationalistic too. They are extremely nationalistic. They are a proud country, and Atesh was upset about what was going on. And these guys were so drunk, they wanted to get belligerent. And so the next thing I know, we get downstairs to the basement, to the first floor, get out the elevator and leave the hotel, and a fight ensues between me and my friend and these three army guys. Next thing I know is the police didn't intervene in things over there too much. It was always the Turkish military. They were the ones you would be afraid of. The police were soft. But the Turkish military, you didn't mess with. They were mean. They were mean. And so they ended up taking us down to the police station. Now, unbeknownst to me, I'm not supposed to do that. I work for the State Department. You don't go to a facility like that without calling someone from the State Department to go with you. Now, I'm a GI. I didn't know anything about that. I was still relatively new in the country. So I was basically not reprimanded, but I was explained to that you don't do stuff like that. And the Turkish government was ready to not allow those guys to leave the country. They were going PCS, back to the States. And they were ready to not allow them to leave the country. They were going to hold them in the country. Well, that's not good. And that was a major international incident waiting to happen. Mr. Mace called me up to his office, and he talked to me. He said, Robert, he said, we need Atesh to talk to the police and explain to them that he doesn't want to press any charges against these guys, and he's willing to allow them to go PCS back to the United States. And he said, talk to him, Robert. I know you're good friends with him. Talk to him and find out what we can do to help him make that decision. And so I did. I went and had a talk with Atesh, and we talked about it, and he was really upset. He was extremely upset about it. And I said, well, I'll set up a meeting. I said, I don't know what you and Mr. Mace are going to decide to do, but I'll set up a meeting. I'll tell Mr. Mace you want to sit down and talk with him, and I'll let you two guys sit down and talk it out to decide what needs to happen for these guys to be able to leave the country. Because what was that? I'm trying to think of the command that handles that. It's I don't remember the name of the command that handled those issues in Europe, but it was the MedPac, the MedPac. That's what it was called, MedPac, the Mediterranean, and they were ready to get involved in it. They were, and so finally, I guess Tesh sat down with Mr. Mace, and they worked out some type of type of agreement, and they were finally able to leave the country. But yeah, that was kind of sticky there, because they were ready to force those guys to. They were going to send them to jail. They basically going to send them to prison, and not let them go back PCS to the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things can get sticky overseas. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
they can get sticky, and a lot of times we as Americans don't realize that we're visitors to this country. As simple as that. You just can't come over here and be obnoxious, and do all this obnoxious, crazy stuff, because you're visiting their country, and you have to follow their laws and their rules. The American laws and rules don't apply to you here. You can just throw those out the window. And you have to realize and understand that when you go to visit another country. And a lot of times, Americans don't do that. And to tell you the truth, overseas, I ran into some extremely obnoxious American people. I wouldn't want them coming to my house. Some of them, I'm serious, just by the way they act, But that's a different story.
All right. Well, thank you, sir.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you allowing me to talk about some of this, and to just give people an opportunity to be able to share this with me. I probably shared some stuff that I really haven't shared with any one individual before. Maybe bits and pieces, but not just like an entire synopsis of the things that transpired, during my brief life on this planet. It's been a good one. It's been a real good one.
Now it's going to be transcribed for everybody to
I'm sorry?
see. So now it's going to be transcribed for generations to come.